Hello everyone and welcome back to the Slow Car Salon for this very special episode that is going to be focusing solely on wiring that 1UZ into your Celica. Now previously I was going to have this outsourced, have somebody else do it, but that person fell off, so I decided to put in the time, the resources, and gather every single resource that I possibly could, every note, diagram, every person with the knowledge, to put together an ultimate guide for you, the people of the Dragon community, so you can learn how to do this yourself. Because yes, this harness may look like a whole lot of spaghetti right now, and wiring may seem very daunting, but I'm going to make it as simple as I possibly can so you can do it at home as well. So buckle up and let's get started. Alright, let's start by taking a look at what we'll be dealing with. Let's start off with the harness here. This is probably the worst example of a wiring harness you could possibly pick up. I got this out of a 91 LS400, and in my haste of trying to get it out of the car, I didn't take any of the plastics that normally go on around the back of the engine, so I just have a bunch of open wires like this. Not only that, I had to cut a lot of wires, O2 sensor wires, the automatic transmission wires here. It's in really bad shape, and there's a bunch of broken connectors everywhere. But I just thought it would be a good example harness in terms of reworking so that I could show you how to do it. So yeah, this does not look great, but we're gonna make it look really, really great. So yeah, even though this is a 91 harness, it'll work on the 92 engine. As far as I'm aware, 90 through 94 are electrically equivalent, and I believe 90 through 92 are mechanically equivalent, as then the 93 and 94 engines got secondary air injection for emissions reasons. Next up, we have the ECU. Now this is, as well as one of the ECU connectors that comes off of the LS400, this is 896615032, and this is particularly the ECU that you would find on a 90 to 94 US delivered Lexus LS400. And this has a particular pin configuration here, as there are four, or I should say connector configuration, as there are four connector bodies that would plug into this ECU. And the count for the pins within each connector is 26, 16, 22, and 26, going here from left to right. Now, to get a better understanding of where all of these wires and endpoints are supposed to go, I had to get my hands on some literature, as you may have seen in the beginning of the video. Two of the books that I'm going to be relying on to understand what the 1UZ harness is like are these two volumes of the original Lexus LS400 factory service manual. And the end of volume 2 is what we care about, because that is the volume that contains all of the electrical diagrams in the back. So that will tell us where everything is supposed to go as far as on the engine and what those endpoints are. To then know where to connect those to the Celica, then I have the original Celica wiring diagram booklet, as well as a bunch of other notes that I've compiled from other people who have done these kind of swaps with 1UZs and within Celicas. And similarly, this has pages full of where all the endpoints are, and a specific breakdown in certain areas of the vehicle where you might find where these wires are, what connectors they have. So yeah, the factory book goes into extreme detail as far as what's on the car, which is another good thing as far as what we need. If you can't get your hands on that, that's okay. If you have the original repair manual for your car, similar to the LS400 books, you'll be able to see all of the wiring endpoints in the back of the book, and they all have these pages that you'll be able to splay out like this and get an idea and a kind of a big picture form of how everything is supposed to hook up. So those are our reading resources so that we can understand exactly how that harness is supposed to hook up into the car. Next, to get that harness nice and pretty, we have an assembly of connectors and harness tapes and heat shrink. And these are what's going to help make the harness look good and seal up connections where we need. These are Tessa tape harness wraps One's kind of a softer fabric, one's more of a rougher textile, I guess you could say. I'll put all the part numbers for everything in the description of the video here. As far as the connectors, I got a variety of connectors from TE or Tyco. They are the Econo Seal type connector for certain things where on the harness, because some of those broken connectors you can buy online from particularly one supplier I got them from was called Ballinger Motorsports, and they sell connector kits where you can buy all the connectors like for fuel injectors and the coolant temp sensors and things like that, and even the O2 sensors. But in some cases where some connectors are just simply no longer available, I'll be using my own solution with these connectors in order to make sure I can connect the two reliably, because maybe one side is broken and even the other side is broken and I can't find either end. So that's where those will come in handy. Now, to replace that section in the middle of the harness where everything was basically open because I did not retain any of the plastics that normally would screw into the back of the motor, what I have are a bunch of these harness wraps, and they are a braided kind of configuration. So instead of that corrugated split sleeve, these are split, but then they have a kind of a nice abrasion resistant braid to them, and I got a bunch of different sizes all from Summit Racing. I think that will make for a very nice street spec harness. This is not mil spec or anything crazy like that. I think this will be able to provide a nice street spec look and keep everything from heat and abrasion and any of the other things that might go on in the engine bay. Now, where we have cut connectors and things where I need to maybe extend parts of the harness, I have here a roll of various colors of 16 gauge wire from MasterCar and a variety of much thicker gauge cables, like ground cables, and this particular 4 gauge wire, which will be used to connect the battery post to where the actual battery connection used to be on the Celica. Now, in this pile of wires, I also have another special little bit of wire, and this is shielded cable, and this is particularly for the O2 sensors because the O2 sensor signals are very sensitive to noise because they only range from about 0.1 to 0.9 volts. And that means they're very susceptible to noise when you have, say, a 12-volt line right next to it. So this cable essentially has a regular conductor going through, a layer of insulation, and then a shield on top of that, which then is connected to a grounding point on the car to isolate the signal line from noise. And I'll show you how to connect these types of wires together, especially if you have 2 cut ends. It turns out it's actually pretty simple. So, with all this, of course, you'll need basic things like a soldering iron, solder, other smaller sizes of heat shrink, crimps, or anything else you may prefer to use in order to put 2 different wires together, however you prefer. To make life easier when working with this harness, what I've got is actually a big old 4x4 piece of plywood behind me, because this is what I'm going to use to actually string the harness up so that I can spread out each individual line so I can see exactly what I'm working with. That way I'm not working with what appears to be a whole lot of spaghetti right in front of you. I know I keep saying that, but do you like your spaghetti with red sauce or with white sauce? I prefer mine on a board with nails in it. Well, it certainly helps sort things out when you have the whole harness mounted up like this. Now, I ended up using screws instead of nails just because it worked better. But anyways, we have, I guess, all of our different legs of the harness to deal with now. The ECU end, this end which has stuff for the igniters and the airflow meter, this end which has a bunch of fuel injector connectors, TPS, some coolant temp sensors, a coil connector. Now, of course, I'm going through all this like I know it because, yeah, I've been able to read the different books that I have and become familiar with all these different parts of the harness. And I'll be going through each and every single one of those with you, so don't worry. Let's see here, that looks like knock sensors and starter signal on its own little sub-harness, interestingly. Another little leg of, let's see, what is this, diagnostic box, the IACV, I think that's for the cold start injector, could be wrong. And then another leg of fuel injectors with stuff for the EGR, and the connectors for the, I guess, sub harness that goes to the front crank harness, which we have rebuilt before, but I did make a small mistake on that, so we'll be going through that as well. We also have this end of wires that was for the transmission, as well as O2 sensing wires. I guess that one would be for the left-hand bank. You can see there's the shielding around the conductor on that wire. And then same over here, another bundle for some O2 sensor wires, as well as some, I guess these brown wires are some, the browns and the white with black stripe. Those are a bunch of grounds. We'll take a look at how to connect those up. And you might be wondering, well, how do we get started? There's so much to do. Well, I guess we can try picking one thing. We can either start replacing connectors, rewrapping the looms, etc. But I think it would be a little smarter to start by removing the looms in certain places so that we can start removing the automatic transmission related wires. And I started by just ruling out which wires here are meant for the O2 sensor on the left-hand bank. You're gonna have one wire that's shielded for the actual signal, one red wire that is the start of the heater circuit for the O2 sensor, which wasn't exactly obvious which red wire it was on the end of these looms that I pulled out here. So what I ended up doing was going to the ECU connector down here and finding pin number 20, which is, it's the middle pin on the bottom row there. And that has a red wire coming out of the bottom like so. And what I did was probe that with a multimeter on continuity mode, and then found that it was this wire here. And then for that, you'll have a ground, brown wire to hook up, and then a black-red stripe wire, which is the heater circuit power. So going through that one more time, you have the shielded O2 signal connector, the black and red for battery power, brown for ground, and red for the O2 sensor heater circuit. Now you'll have a couple extra battery power and ground wires, but I think we can put those off to the side as long as we have one of the grounds there. Now, one thing that helped me rule this out was there was a white connector hanging off by all of the ECU connectors down here. After I untaped all of the wiring so that I could pull stuff through if I needed to, I found that this loop of wire connected for the white plug here, which is meant for the transmission controls. So we can definitely do without that. And I was able to pull that through the grommet here, and it helped kind of rule out which wires I needed to look for in this area. There's still a few more here that were cut from the harness going down the left-hand bank of the engine towards the transmission. So I'll confirm whether or not these are needed. One thing that I know I will not need that I pinned from the, or rather de-pinned from the ECU connector here, are these wires, which are meant for the ECT control solenoids, or electronically controlled transmission. And those came off over here. And I can also pull those through and remove them completely. The next couple of wires I can pull out of the remaining bundle. We can start off with this yellow and blue twisted pair, which is meant for the overdrive speed sensor. We can definitely get rid of that. And this twisted pair, which is the ECT control speed sensor. So let's go on and shove those through. We can find, based on, let's see, here's one little bit of the twisted pairs. We can go ahead and hold that steady and just pull that through because we've untaped already. That's one. Here's the other, so let's pull that through. All right, and then we can trace these down and find where they end up plugging in to these ECU connectors. And one thing I found that's very useful is you can get these de-pinning keys off of Amazon. And I find that one of the kind of the thinner square ones work really well with de-pinning these amphenol connectors, and you just have to lift up the gates here in order to be able to pull out the pins here, I guess, because there's a mechanical lock inside that you'll have to push up on from the front face of the connector, and then the gate kind of holds it in as a secondary mechanical lock should that first one fail. So yeah, we'll trace these through, figure out which pins are in there, and pull them out. Next on the list is this black wire with a white stripe. Now this is actually the neutral safety wire, and I'm not going to de-pin it from the harness, but I am going to pull it through just in case we need it for something. I'm certain that for the manual transmission option, we're going to not hook it up, as leaving the circuit open means that you'll be able to start the engine at any time, even if you don't depress the clutch. Next, that yellow and black wire from before can also be tossed aside, as one is for a shifter signal and the other is for a speed sensor that we're also not using. So now that leaves us with quite a few wires that are left for the O2 sensors, as well as a few grounds down here that end up getting connected to the back of the engine block. So that kind of cleans up the engine wiring of all of the transmission related stuff for now. Alright, with all of those transmission wires removed, I got the wiring harness cleaned up a little bit and taped off the sections where certain things like the different O2 sensors are going to go, particularly the upstream ones. As it turns out, the downstream ones end up going on the fourth ECU plug, the additional 26 pin here, this green and yellow wire, and you can see where I've cut them. It's just at the point where the shielding was going over the cable. So those will be for the downstream O2 sensors, which I'll make harnesses for later. But then, yeah, then the grounds are all put aside and taped off, and I started to remove and clean up some of the existing loom and sheathing over the wires to try to get that all cleaned up. And then as far as the additional connectors down here, these contain wires for a lot of other signals that we can get rid of and also clean up later. I think this is a couple of different wires that I think end up going over to the diagnostics box right there. And I think we can remove that later on, but for now, and I think for like test fitting and wire extension purposes, that should be okay, because the next thing I want to do now is start looking at the wiring for the igniters, because in the engine bay, I want to position them over here, which means I need to run a line across the back and up, I guess, to the point where, like, say, like where the injector plugs would go here, run an even longer length along the side that would then plug into the boxes there. So for that, I'll have to undo the sheathing here for these looms and then try to see how I can bring it all the way across and then even extend it out beyond the plastic housing here for the left-hand bank fuel injectors and other EGR related plugs. And now, after measuring, I found that for the extension of the igniter plugs, they should come off an additional 24 inches off about this point here where the wiring makes a turn for all those fuel injector connectors. So let's see if we try to route this along around here. We can see that, oh, we don't need the AFM plug over here. There. So we can see that if I were to route this along, the plugs are only just long enough for this little bend here. So I think adding an extra 24 inches worth of wire may not be a bad thing. Now, I hope you didn't throw away all of that transmission wiring that we pulled out, because I think this will be perfect in order to extend the wires where necessary, because we'll just be using the OE wire and the same gauge. Then that'll make things a lot easier without having to go out and buy more wire. that's the extension done for the igniter cables. They're about, yeah, as I've measured, about 24 to 26 inches long, out from at least this point here along the harness. So hopefully that will reach. Now I can, when I put the harness in to mock it up, I can obviously go back and check to make sure that length is good. However, I'm confident that what I've done will. And then coming back over here to the single link now for the airflow meter connection, I just wrapped that up in tape and kind of gotten that all secured. Next up, we can make the O2 sensor harnesses. Now, we'll probably start by mocking up what the right-hand bank will look like, and then base that off of what we're gonna do for the left-hand bank, because when we actually put the exhaust manifolds in, the left side won't fit without modification, which we'll get to later on, but the right-hand side will. So hopefully making the length of the harness for that particular connection can translate back over to the left side, or we can possibly make it a little bit longer to give us a little bit more room. And yeah, with the O2 sensors, again, we have a shielded cable, and that is for the O2 sensor signal, and that braid gets grounded later on through the harness. And then we have a couple of wires for the heater circuit in the yellow, power from the black with red stripe wire, and then ground with the brown wire, particularly for the heater circuit signal. And yeah, same goes with the right side. And just that yellow wire is replaced with that red wire that we found before. So for that, we have some braided wire to be able to make those sensor connections. The braid itself is going to be slightly tricky to reconnect, but I think I've figured out a trick on how we can do it. So once we get this all mocked up, I'll show you how. Okay, and the exhaust manifold is in. Now, I should mention that I did replace the exhaust studs on the block just because I bought some new ones and I replaced them anyways while I was in there. I've also got the O2 sensor attached and have the loom hanging off the side here. I believe it's meant to go up the side of the block here somehow, just as far as the way the routing seems to go. Because if I run it over here, I could also become dangerously close to a lot of these fuel lines, although putting it there might not be a terrible idea. So yeah, just as far as routing the O2 sensor wire, just because the sensor ends up pointing downwards as well, it may make sense to run it up the side of the block and up towards the firewall of the car, or run it along the side. Maybe what I can possibly do here is get some more of that DEI heat wrap, put it along those fuel lines, and also a little bit along the harness that I can run up along the side of the frame rail here, and then up and out along here, along some of these evap lines and brake lines, and onto some point on the harness where it branches off around here. That's my thought. What I'm going to do next is actually start kind of laying the harness in there. Might have to take a few other things out of the engine bay here, but at least start by getting the harness sort of layout and seeing exactly where, in terms of where this branch right here ends up coming out. And then, yeah, from there I might have to just move it further down the branch or leave it there as is. Let's just take a look. Okay, and that's all the intake manifolds and a couple other things removed, and I was able to get the wiring harness all mocked up here, and thankfully my igniter extension works, so good to know I've confirmed that. I'll of course make sure that wire bundle is a lot neater once everything gets wrapped up. And then as far as the O2 sensor connections, so this guy is going to have to go down the back of the motor somehow down here. Just kind of extrapolating from where that O2 sensor is down here on the right hand side manifold, which also the sensor wires are down here. So that's also good to know, so I can just kind of make a straight shot down and then perhaps shield it, get some thinner diameter DEI heat shielding so that can go on down past the exhaust manifold, no problem. Do the same thing for this side and just sort of route it along the block, and yeah, similarly heat wrap it and not have to worry about the block melting the wires. Alright, so I've taken the harness back out after test fitting and trying to get an idea of what length I should be making those O2 sensor harnesses. And I've already made one side and put in a brand new connector, which I was able to source from Ballinger Motorsports. And yeah, it came out really nice. And this idea with where I have like heat shrink and braid coming up to like off of the main branch here, it's kind of going to give you a baseline of how I'm going to end up doing all the rest of the harness. Just make sure your wires are mostly the same length so you don't end up with funky little curves like this, although this shouldn't affect functionality, it just looks a little weird. So anyways, for the other side, what we're going to do is just add some small extensions to the main wires, both the power in black and with red stripe, the ground, which is brown, and then the heater, O2 sensor heater signal wire, which is this yellow, and then the actual O2 sensor signal itself, which is on a shielded wire. And let me show you what you're going to do to join two sections of shielded wire. Alright, so to start, we're going to take our original signal wire, strip off the outermost layer of insulation, and peel back the shielding around it. And then, of course, get a length of the signal wire inside and strip it. Then next, you'll take your new signal wire, strip off the outermost insulation, and what you can do here is then peel that back, like so. And so you can peel it back all the way till the end of where you made your cut. And then you'll be left with something like this, in which you will then also strip off the signal wire inside so that we can then solder it to the end of the original piece here. Just before we start soldering, we want to get a nice little piece of heat shrink on here, and possibly one larger, such that we can, from here, I guess, slip the heat shrink over our shielding on one side or even the other, like so. It might push back a little bit, but it's not a big deal. We just want to have that, tucked back so we have the signal wire exposed, and then we'll just go ahead and solder that to the new one. And I always like to do a little mechanical connection first. So what I'll do is I'll twist the wires together physically, like so. Then I'll go in and solder. Once that's done, we can take our soldered connection here and slip our heat shrink over it. And really important part about the heat shrink is that we do not at all want the shielding to touch the electrical signal on the inside, because that will obviously short it out. So let's make sure that those are completely isolated. Make sure that your shielding is completely peeled back, like so. And then slip your heat shrink over it. And then from there, we can go in and seal the heat shrink. Get your heat gun, and then just simply apply your heat and let that shrink over your soldered connection. Like so. And then finally, here, so that we can bridge the two sheathing braids together, I'm going to get this, get these braids kind of peeled back over the solder connection that we just made, like so. And then connect the two with a little piece of aluminum foil. just want enough that'll kind of cover up both of the shieldings here. And then just, once we get the shielding back over that area, just kind of even it out. And then flatten out your piece of aluminum foil as well as you can. And just wrap it over very nice and taut, like so. Alright, we can wrap that all up, tighten it up, and then finally, our last touch here is going to be additional heat shrink over the ends of the aluminum foil, just to make sure that the ends are sealed properly with the ends of the wire here. Looks like I need a slightly larger piece for this end, as this will not slip over it. Okay, we'll get that slipped over, like so. And then, as before, we'll just get our heat gun and seal those over. And that's it. So when you're rebuilding your O2 sensor harness, that's all you need to do in order to join two ends of a signal cable, so that, in this case, we can lengthen it. When this end gets terminated into the connector, though, we'll just peel back the insulation and remove the ground sheathing around it, and then that will just go directly into the pin into the connector housing. And then, yeah, same goes with all the rest of the wires here. We'll extend those and then also go ahead and terminate them, for which you want to make sure that you have a good and proper crimping tool, and one that will accept the size of the pins that you're using. Ballinger Motorsports can supply you with a connector and pin kit, and they'll have little insulation boots that will go particularly on the inside and the back side of the connector here, for waterproofing purposes. So make sure you assemble that all together and put your sheathing and heat shrink on for your wiring before the connector goes on. Okay, and that's both of the upper O2 sensor harnesses made, and boy, they've come out real nice. Now, in order to make sure that I was pinning the connectors properly, I went back to volume 2 of the LS400 manual here, and I was able to check exactly which pins they go into, and you can see there's a 1, 2, 3, 4 labeling here for which wires are which in terms of where, exactly where they go into the back of the connector. And the back of the connector is labeled, if I can get the angle properly here. You can see sort of embossed into the back of the connector housing numbers 1 there on the upper right hand side, 2 on the upper left, and then an embossing kind of in this cavity here in the connector, and it says the bottom right is number 3 and the bottom left is number 4. So in that order it kind of goes 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the bottom. And the order of the wires that go into the back of the connector, here we have number 1 is yellow or red for the O2 sensor heater signal, 2 is the black-red wire for power, 3 is the actual O2 sensor signal, which is the shielded cable that we joined together earlier on, and 4 is the brown ground wire, and those are both just bridged together
later on, and then are linked to a junction connector somewhere else. But those are the grounds, and I just follow that convention for both of the connectors. And now we have both of the harnesses lengthened and braided and sheathed up and heat shrink properly. So now we'll have a robust harness build here. And yeah, the rest of all of the links here coming off of the main harness here are going to be about the same. I think I'm going to go ahead and just delete all of these plastic housings, these hard plastic housings for the connectors, just because as you take them apart, they're so old and so brittle that they're just going to fall apart anyway. So I think on all three of them, I'm just going to delete them fully and then replace them with this nice braid and branch them off properly. Next is going to be replacing all of the broken harness connectors. And I'll start with, after I take off the plastic housings, I'll start with the right-hand bank injector connectors. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4, and yeah, they're all broken. So first, let me get this torn apart and then strip off all of the sheathing and whatnot, and then we'll de-pin these connectors and see whether or not we need to replace the pins entirely or just the connector housing. Alright, so after going ahead and stripping all the rest of the insulation and sleeves and looms off all the rest of the wires, I started getting to the fuel injector connectors and putting new connectors on them and the sleeving and heat shrink and all that good stuff. And I found that, yeah, it's rather difficult to de-pin these connectors, and in some cases the insulation has started to degrade quite significantly in some of them. So what I'm just doing is cutting them at the base of the connector here, and then crimping on the new terminals and with new terminal boots and connectors, and ending up with this. I just have to be a little bit more careful to make sure the boots actually slip in all the way, but we end up with a nice, fresh, new, and not broken injector connector. So I'm just going to go ahead and go through all the rest and get those fuel injector connectors done, as well as a few others, including in particular, where is it? In particular here, the IACV connector, which you can see the connector housing is completely sheared off. And I think in similar fashion, I'm just going to chop the wire at the base of the connector housing. It will become a little shorter, but the wiring harness as a whole does allow for a little bit more slack. And the fact that I've deleted all of the factory plastic housings and I'm going to instead use these braided looms, I think that'll end up giving me a little bit more slack overall, despite the wiring harness not being exactly secure in every location. And where I guess I do end up mounting it and needing to secure it down, I can hopefully find a screw boss and P-clamp it down. All right, back to work. Alright, so let's take a quick look at how you would go about replacing the connectors on your harness. We're going to take this fuel injector connector as an example. I already tried de-pinning the other connectors here, and I found it very difficult. I guess there's a retention device or something in here, but more than likely if you try to take it apart, it's going to shatter. So instead, I'm just going to try to cut the back of the connector here. Of course, taking note of the orientation of the wires, we can take a quick look with a new connector, and we can see that, okay, this is the tab side, and we can see that we have a black wire. There you go. You have a black wire with an orange stripe on the left and a blue wire on the right. So let's just take note of that orientation, because then when we plug it all back in, we're going to make sure that it's of course in the same orientation so that the injectors still work. So first, let's get a pair of flush cutters so we can get as close to the back of the connector housing as possible. Now, we do have a little bit of extra slack inside the stock harness for this kind of thing, so we don't have to worry about extending the wires. But if your wires are particularly damaged, then I would recommend trying to extend them, kind of in the same fashion of how I did for the Ignitor connectors, where we get some good quality wire and solder each end with that mechanical connection. But in this case, we can just go ahead and snip these off, like so. And we can go ahead and toss the old one away. Next, grab your wire strippers and strip off the ends, but not too much, because we do need to make sure that some amount of it is still going to be captured by the pins that we're going to be crimping on. So maybe you want, let's say, about 5 or 6 millimeters worth of the copper still exposed here, maybe a little bit less. Next, hopefully with your connector kit, you also got not only the connectors, but the little rubber boots as well. They're real tiny and may be very hard to lose, so try your best to keep track of them, because these you'll need to slip over the wires like so. You're just going to carefully center it over the conductor here, like that, and then just slip it on. And maybe leave another 4 millimeters or so off the end like that. Rinse and repeat for the other side. And there we go. We have both of the wires now with the new boots and some copper exposed for the pins. And now for the pins. The way these work is that we have a larger section here, which is going to be where the wire is actually captured, and then a smaller section here, which is where the copper conductor is going to be connected and crimped on. So not only will this larger section capture the wire insulation, but also the boot, kind of like this. So you'll see here that the crimp area is going to capture the green boot as well as the wire, and then the smaller crimp section is going to capture just the conductor. So we're going to make sure that it does so when we crimp it. Now, for the crimps, I got some crimps just off of Amazon, but I made sure that they came with a particular set of crimp inserts for these non-insulated terminals, and they have a variety of sizes. And what I've found is that the smallest one is almost a little bit too small, and the larger, or second from smallest rather, is a little bit too big. The smallest one does a good job of crimping the wire section, and the larger one kind of does a good job of holding everything together. So what I do is I end up using the slightly larger one for the first stage, and the next one for the second stage, but I don't crimp it down all the way. And there's a release here that I'll use when I'm done to then just kind of open it back up, like so. So that way I don't damage the crimp when I'm in the middle of the process. So what I'll do before I actually go ahead and crimp this pin is to ensure that the wire doesn't slip out of the pin while I'm putting it in the crimp device, is I'll lay it in and then use a small pair of pliers to kind of capture the rubber boot here with the larger end of the terminal here so that it doesn't slip out or misalign while I'm using the crimper. Kind of like this. There, so now it's obviously it's holding itself, you know, without me having to assist by holding the backside. So now we're in a good shape to actually use the crimper. So I'll use that second from smallest setting, the middle setting here, line it all up. So you'll notice here that there's a larger section, and that's going to be where the larger part of the crimp, where the wire and boot is going to be captured, and then a smaller section towards the back where the wire is going to be crimped and captured. So make sure you line it up accordingly and don't get the actual connector area captured inside of there, because you don't want to crush it, otherwise you won't be able to actually connect it. So you'll see this is kind of how I'm aligning it here, just so yeah, we're just barely inside of that. And I'll go and crimp all the way down and release. And you'll see that, yeah, the boot gets torn just a little bit there, and it's not a huge deal, but the main thing is that the main crimp area is now crimped down a little bit. However, it's not down all the way. So that's where I get the smaller section in, line it up, and go, but only part of the way. And then I'll just use a little screwdriver because my fingers don't really fit in that gap. And I'll crimp a little bit more and then push on the tab with the screwdriver like that, and then release. We'll carefully wiggle the terminal out. And voila! You have a nicely crimped terminal. You can always give it a test by yoinking on it to make sure that it's not going to pull out, because imagine you're trying to now, you know, in the future, de-pin one of your fuel injector connectors here, and what's going to happen is if that crimp terminal is not mechanically welded to that wire, you're going to have a situation where you pull the wire out and the terminal is not going to come with it, and you want to avoid that situation later down the line, let's say when you're doing work like this and you're redoing your entire harness. So make sure that's crimped down properly and you have a good mechanical weld, essentially. We're going to do the same for the next one. Same procedure. I'll lay it down inside the terminal like so. Use the pliers and kind of capture the boot in place, like so. Taking care to use the correct hands, even though the camera angle might not be the best, so I can actually do a good job of this. And even if your wire gets pulled back a little bit, you still have a little bit of room to sort of slide the wire through the boot and make sure that the conductor is lined up in the crimp area. So that way you don't have a partial crimp on your conductors here. And same as before, we'll take the middle setting, make sure that's all aligned properly, and crimp down. There's the first stage. And get the second stage ready. In this case, I was able to crimp down all the way. We're going to wiggle that around gently to free it from the crimp, because like I said, it's just on the smaller side, so if you can somehow get yourself a slightly more correctly sized crimp. I guess there's a notation for the size here. I think that's just for maybe the size of the terminal. May be able to get the right... Oh. And it seems like, yeah, should be like an in-between size between the smallest and largest of these teeth within the crimp tool. There is another set that comes with these Wi-Fi crimpers that are smaller, but I think you would be able to get a tool from TE themselves, who make these connectors, like for the fuel injectors. These are like the I think TE like Econo Seal, I think, style connectors. So if you get a tool directly from them, I'm sure it'll be way more expensive, but it'll be the right size compared to this. But this gets pretty darn close and still provides the correct sizing here mostly, and provides good mechanical weld. So anyway, now that that's done, we can get to the business of the looming and the heat shrink and all that. And what we're going to do for this is take some of our braided loom that we've been using. I got the stuff from Summit Racing, showed it at the beginning of the video. I think this is the half-inch stuff, and then similarly, or perhaps quarter-inch. And then similarly, some heat shrink that I also got off of Amazon. I think this starts off as half-inch and then shrinks on down. But the point is that it will ensure that it captures the loom and then the wires. It doesn't. I think the shrink ratio is about 3:1, so it doesn't fully capture the wires, but it gets a good hold on them. Plus, there's glue on the inside. So what we're going to do is just slip our cables in, and normally you could also, go ahead and take the cable and just kind of slip the loom in like that and kind of push it on through and run your finger to make sure that the loom is fully encapsulating the wires, like so. Like there you go. And then what we can do is then take our heat shrink and then slip this over. And this is a perfect time. Don't put your connector on yet, because this is a perfect time to put on your loom and your heat shrink, because you would not be able to do it otherwise. So we're going to get that slipped on like so, and maybe leave about half-inch or so of wire exposed out the end there. So the next, we'll position that exactly where we want. Make sure we have enough slack in our wires, and then take our heat gun. I have this little Hako here, has two settings, one for hot and one for extremely hot, melt your face and fingers off hot. I use the hottest setting, but I try to keep a little bit more distance away from the target, just to make sure I don't go and melt the loom here, because that can happen. All right, so give that a moment to heat up, and then go for it. Alright, we'll put that aside. If you're working on a table, you can usually just point your heat gun up and just place your wire and kind of run it over just to make sure. But in our case, I just slipped it over and left it as is. I'm just going to reposition that just a tiny bit. Get a little bit of excess glue off. Alright, and now that you have this wrapped up, heat shrunk, and pretty much ready to go, now we can take our connector, and remembering our orientation, where we have the black wire on the left-hand side and the blue wire on the right-hand side. I've ended up, I guess, flipping those orientations, but no worries, because we can finagle our wiring around to accommodate, like so. And another thing to notice is that with these connectors, at least in the orientation that I was holding it in, the retaining tabs for this connector here, they're positioned along the bottom, and you'll see once the camera focuses, you'll see that through the holes where the pins go through, the retention tabs there are at the bottom. So when you have your wires kind of oriented like this, you want to make sure that the tabs are oriented in the correct direction. So with that, you can actually now they're sort of oriented where having the connector upside down now will work. So we'll just go ahead and slot those in like this. making sure that everything's even. Okay. And give those boots a little bit of help. Yeah, you'll want to make sure that the boot goes in all the way, as you'll see, that there's no green sticking out of the connector housing there. So make sure when you install your connector that you make sure that it, with your fingers or a tool or something, that it goes all the way in. May take a little bit of force just because the boot kind of expands, and you have to make sure it gets in there with with enough force so that it produces a good seal between the connector housing and the rubber. There you go. I heard the click. And just to help the boot along, because a little bit is still sticking out here, I'm just going to get the end of a flat blade screwdriver and gently coax in the boot the rest of the way. Like that. Not enough to tear the rubber, but just enough to encourage it to push in all the way. And there you go. So now you've just redone a segment of your harness, added a new connector, and kind of this procedure is sort of then just rinse and repeat for the rest of the harness where you have connectors like this to replace. So make sure that you have good crimp tools, good heat shrink, good loom, and all of your, not only with your connectors, but you also have the pin and boot kit along with it. I'll post a link in the description where you can get these connectors at Ballinger Motorsports, and you can get, if you don't want to do any of this work and you'd rather do some soldering or crimping, you can actually get pigtails made where they've already done the crimping and put little ends on the wires. But that just means that you'll have to then cut part of your original harness and then solder the wires in later up the line. But I elected to go for the more manual method just because I wanted to illustrate how you could go about doing it yourself. So with that, let's finish up the rest of this entire branch here. Now I'm at the point where I'm replacing the two front crank harness connectors. Yeah, both the male and female sides. Now the ones on the main engine wire here, they are female receptacle, but they don't have any other tabs that necessarily hold them onto the engine, because usually on the bottom of the intake manifold you have this little bracket that then holds these two connectors up in place, sort of like this. But and they do kind of provide, sort of hold the connectors up like this. You'll see they kind of slot into place. But, and they do hold the connectors up and out of the way, but on the new connectors that I have, one of the 6-pin connectors, it does have a provision for something like that, but it's not quite the same size or shape. And the 2-pin side, 2-pin connector, at least on the, where it's supposed to be the female pin side, it only has the tab to actually retain the connector and no connector or tab to retain it in place. So I think that means I'll end up just deleting this piece and just throwing in the new connectors and putting the female sides here on the engine wire side and the male sides on the front crank harness side, which means that this particular TE Econoseal connector is going to go on the crank harness, and we have this one as well, which is also for receptacle for male pins. That will also go on the front crank harness side. So the two that will go actually on the engine will be this guy and this guy. And I'll post the link in the description for all the different TE connector part numbers I've used in case you need to go this route as well. They also have little sub part numbers for all the other little retainers and other pieces that go inside these connector housings, for which I'll also put links to, because they're all very little specific numbers. And if you don't have access to these, as I was able to get these through work, you may have to find an alternative to these connectors. They may be bulkier, they may not be exactly the same like the ones that are on the harness already, but you can get something that's probably pretty close and not too bulky in case you need to replace them. I also have the particular pins that need to go along with it as well, and the boots here that are also meant to go with the wire like I showed in the fuel injector harness repair. As far as the front crank harness is concerned, before I go ahead and replace those, I'll see if I can wiggle this out, but I'm pretty sure that this plate that sits behind the cam pulley has to come out to release this fully, but I think I should be able to work with the amount of slack that I have back here in order to do my repinning work. The only other thing is that where I accidentally routed these two connectors, this little gray one that you can see behind the thermostat housing and this black one for the coil, they're actually meant to go over here to that coil and this little device here. I haven't exactly worked out what that is, but I'll check the diagram and report back to you. Anyway, what I'm gonna do is then just kind of take the coil off, take part of the thermostat neck off, and just reroute those harnesses through this loom and down through this P-clamp. Now I also realize that the connector here is also dangerously close to the belt in terms of proximity. I can try to wiggle it out of the way or kind of pull it out of the way, but that's almost as good as I can get it. I wonder if, I don't know if taping it or anything would help because it's already kind of sitting onto the cam cover here, and I can't really put it back anymore, and adding tape would just increase its overall thickness, so I'll just have to make sure to keep an eye on that area over time and make sure it doesn't wiggle around, because it is pretty secure, but I guess this end is still quite loose, so maybe I'll just have to secure this little loop of tape against this part of this loom here. Alright, and with a quick fix, I was able to resolve the routing for the lines here for this doodad. I'm still trying to figure out what this is, and the coil pack harness. So that's all now tucked away and P-clamped, still in kind of close proximity to that connector, but it will still clear. So now this area is ready to receive all of the connections from the actual engine harness, which is right around here. So we'll have, the coolant temp sensor for the ECU, the cold start injector time switch, the coil connector that is meant to actually go there, and okay, that's fuel injector off to the side, TPS off to the side, and the single pin right there is for the gauge reading sensor for the coolant temp. Another quick refinement I want to show you is with the front crank harness area here. If you didn't pull this part off, which is like a small water pipe for the original LS400 overflow, go ahead and go back to the junkyard, pick it up, and cut the water pipe off of this bracket, because this bracket allows you to more solidly mount this cam angle sensor connector and bolt it up to the original cam belt cover. and has this other little boss here that I was able to just kind of use and zip tie my cables to. Now it's really secure and is definitely going to be out of the way of the pulleys here. The only one I have left to figure out as far as securing is this one. I might just secure it to this, the lower end of the overflow hose that goes into this hose here. But I just wanted to show you that as far as cleaning this area up. Alright, well that took many hours, but the harness is finally done. New connectors everywhere I could, especially for not only the fuel injectors, but a lot of plugs up here for like temperature sensors and other things, like I said, for the front crank harness. And I'll have to, of course, now work on the front crank harness and make sure I have the appropriate connectors for those guys. But it's as fresh as I could make it in this beautiful loom, and I zip tied a lot of it together just to make sure that it would hold really good on the back of the engine and kind of hold the branches in place. So it might not look very pleasing, but when it's behind the engine and you see all the rest of the branches that have been heat shrinked and whatnot, that'll look really good. I do have a couple of ground wires that I still need to put ring terminals and the braided loom on, but I'll have to just go and pick those up later on and crimp that all together and finish that off. And now, time to replace the mating end of the front crank harness. One small addition I want to make to the harness here is some of this DEI Easy Loom split line sleeve, and it's supposed to be a thermal barrier between hot parts of the car and your wiring. So I figure I'll use some of this just on my O2 sensor harnesses that I made, just because of their proximity to the exhaust. Should be fairly simple. It's split sleeve, so we can just slip it over the existing braid that I have here and give the wires here a better chance at a long life. Now with that installed, one part that does come with the DEI wrap is some of this silicone tape, which I guess one would use to wrap the ends, because I previously used heat shrink over my braiding, but of course now since I have the connector over the end and I'm not necessarily willing to depin it, you'll use some of this tape to, I guess, secure the ends, on both ends of the loom here where you've installed it. So I'm going to use that as well. And there we go. So the silicone tape is self-adhesive, so it actually sticks to itself. So make sure you get a really good and tight first wind so that it's as tight as possibly can be, and then the subsequent winds will be based off of that first one, because like I said, it's self-adhesive, and when you get a good tight first wind, it'll turn out really nice. It kind of a little doubled up here on these O2 sensor connectors here, but I wanted to make sure that they were protected just because of how close in proximity they get to the engine. Alright, well I'm back at the junkyard again. As you can see, that's because we forgot a couple of things for this wiring job. One is under here where you have the ECU connections, the 26, 16, 22, 26, there's going to be 2 green circuit opening relays next to that ECU. Grab the connectors for them. You will need them. I grabbed both. And this is also a 1992 LS400, or sorry, this was a 1992 LS400. And one thing I forgot last time I was pulling stuff is to grab these 2-pin connectors that are underneath the carpet in this little plastic channel. They'll normally go through the floor with the little grommet to get to where the O2 sensors are. Now, as far as I can tell, I cannot buy these connectors anywhere, these 2 pins. I was going to repin them to 4-pin to something more common, but that means every time you get new O2 sensors, you have to repin them. So don't forget to grab these. They're underneath the carpets of the LS400s, particularly the early Series 1 LS400s. I'm not going to need this end, obviously, where the blue and white, because that was where the O2 sensor was, but this is the end you're going to need. And here you can see it has the shielded end for the O2 sensor signal and the brown ground for the signal. So don't forget to grab both sides and grab 2 of those circuit opening relay connections.
Alright, that's going to be it for this episode. I think I'm going to split this wiring video into 2 parts. The first part here, as you've just seen, focusing on the engine wiring. It's interesting because this part took me at least 80 hours. I know this is more to be a demonstration of, you know, getting the absolute worst harness possible and refurbishing it, but of course your mileage may vary. It could take you less if your harness is in better shape, or even more if you're less experienced with wiring. But I'm hoping that this video kind of showed you the basics and what I did to at least get a stock harness going. I spent probably around $500 on connectors, materials, and whatnot to make this happen. A lot of off-the-shelf options out there from Tweaked, My Wire Shop, or Panic Wire are a lot more expensive, but they all take their own solutions, a different path, because I'm trying to make this work with as many of the stock relays and circuit opening relays and fuses as possible. So the next part of this video is going to, in part 2 rather, is going to focus on these little connectors right here, which are branches off of the main ECU connectors, as well as that 4th ECU plug that's also a 26 pin. I've mapped out already where all those wires are supposed to go and where I can find them in the car side. And since I've got that all sorted out, and part 2 is going to highlight that, I'll see you in the next one.